Everybody having a good time at Howard Days? All right, yeah, me too. Anyway, we're going to get started with the panel here, and I think it's called Conan, Kull, Bran, or I can't remember the name of it. I wrote it, but I can't remember the name of it. Anybody help me out? Feel free. What we're doing here at Howard Days this year, we're celebrating several anniversaries. One, of course, is the 30th anniversary of Project Pride, and we had a big celebration about that. Yeah. We had a real nice celebration last night on that. The Robert E. Howard Foundation donated $1,000 to Project Pride, so hooray for the Robert E. Howard Foundation, and hooray for Project Pride. Anyway, this panel was set up to celebrate, the 90th anniversary of Robert E. Howard as the creator of sword and sorcery fiction. And there's all kinds of debate, but for all intents and purposes, the modern day genre of sword and sorcery fiction was created by Robert E. Howard. And as you all know, Howard created quite a number of different characters. And so there might be cause for argument about who was the original sword and sorcery character and how did those characters play out over their careers as proponents of sword and sorcery. So we have a panel here of noted experts and raconteurs. Jason Ray Carney is here. Our guest of honor, David C. Smith, Jason Waltz, and Dierk Guenther. And what we're going to do is we're just going to kind of have a free-for-all on Solomon Kane, Bran McMorn, Conan, Kull, yeah. Actually, for most people, the Shadow Kingdom, the 1929 story featuring King Kull, was the origins of sword and sorcery. So we're going to play off of that, but also talk about Howard's other sword and sorcery characters. So we're going to get to it. I'm just going to sit around and I'll occasionally ask a question if we don't have any questions from the audience. So I will turn it over. We'll start with our guest of honor, David C. Smith.
Okay. Good afternoon. For my money, I love the Shadow Kingdom. I don't know how many times I've read it. And for me, it is the start of the sword and sorcery genre. For a number of reasons. It has most of the elements in it that we think of sword and sorcery, and it's also violent and paranoid, which kind of goes along with the genre too often enough. But if you think of it, or when I think of it, the genre as we've come to know it wasn't yet fully cooked or fully baked with the Shadow Kingdom. It's still, despite the fact that we have this wonderfully elaborate or romantic lost world aspect to it, Fallujah and the other kingdoms, it still doesn't feel really solid enough. We know that Howard created it. We know it took him a couple years to get it right, and he's kind of feeling his way with what kind of character do I have here. It's still a Gothic swashbuckler, very much like Solomon Kane. Bran McMorn's not really Gothic swashbuckling. He's the barbarian element here. But for me, when we get to Conan and when Howard kind of solidifies, it creates the foundation for Conan in the Hyborian Age, this is where we start to get what really feels like sword and sorcery. And I won't talk forever here, but the foundation of Conan is a lot of these characters that came before. There's a little bit of Kull in him. There's a little bit of Bran McMorn. Certainly the Crusader stories is in there. Steve Costigan, as the earlier panel had mentioned. But Conan is his own man, making his way through a world that's we're somewhat familiar with. He's not searching for God or trying to correct things with God like Solomon Kane. The world he inhabits is much more firmly on a foundation than that of Kull. In some ways, the closest thing to him is Bran McMorn. But with Conan, we have a character that we were talking about this earlier with some of the other guys. We have a character that really fits into the world of the Depression in the early 30s. And these elements come together, and this is what really resonates with us, is this Depression-era mentality that everything's gone to hell, civilization is in ruin or whatever, and when the world calls for a sword, be ready with your sword, because you're going to have to be the last guy standing, maybe. So it very much reflects these values of this broken world of the Great Depression, and then Howard fit into that with his made-up Hyborian world. What Sword and Sorcery is not is knights in shining armor, or made-up fantasy lands with orcs and elves and all this high fantasy. It's very much tough, realistic fiction in its own way, realistic. So that's my long introduction to my thoughts. But
And there's the panel.
and thank you. Drive safe. Drive safe. Sorry, I love this genre, and I've written quite a bit in it, and I get caught up in it. So. Please go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. So these labels aren't always that useful. What Sword and Sorcery was high fantasy, so just take them with a grain of salt. But if we're going to talk about them, I always like to contrast Sword and Sorcery to high fantasy by way of values, and Tolkien versus Howard, and one of the values that Sword and Sorcery seems to uphold is autonomy and individualism, and if you compare that to Tolkien, you have things like duty and sacrificing yourself for a greater cause. I guess you could say quasi-chivalry, So yeah, just I don't know, what do you guys think about that, contrasting Sword and Sorcery to high fantasy? And I can say more about Howard, but what do you think, Dirk?
No, I actually agree with Jason that the labeling is probably not good, because you guys know that Sword and Sorcery has pretty much a bad reputation due to lots of copycats of Howard's seemingly easy formula who totally messed it up, which unfortunately tarnished Howard's reputation. And so, while he is famous for having created this genre, I somehow feel that we somehow need to actually take him a little bit out of that genre, because it's just the name is just too pejorative, unfortunately. And so actually, as we're talking about Sword and Sorcery, what exactly are we talking about? We're talking about, for example, stories.
What are some of the elements?
Exactly. We are talking about stories set in a world, a possible world in past times, and in which, technology does not exist, and that's the come probably what I'm saying here, and people do their fighting with with swords and other older stuff. Magic is possible, but is it really necessary? And then perhaps for you writers, that's something I would really love to hear your opinion about. Is the favorite form of Sword and Sorcery? Is it better the short story or in a novel? For example, here when we look at the Howard stories, they are short stories, and they work excellent. If you look at somebody like Karl Edward Wagner, that's just me. Feel free to crucify me later on for what I'm going to say, but his short stories are really good. His novels,
I agree.
I don't like much at all.
I agree. He stitched together short stories, basically.
So you're the writers. Come on, tell us.
Jason, you have any thoughts?
Well, we covered a lot of ground. Is this on? Can you hear me? We covered a lot of ground there. I did want to just say though, when Bill invited me to sit on this panel, well, first he asked me if I wanted to be on a panel, and I said I'm always willing to talk. And then he said I want to put you on a panel and generate some fisticuffs. I want some argument.
No, you're in the right place, man.
But
the crowd ready.
Let's go.
then he told me the topic, and I'm not seeing how we're gonna get fisticuffs over the topic, to be honest with you.
this kind of sword, not that kind of sword.
Right, exactly.
Okay, I like those pastiches a lot, and I don't
No,
like
no,
our-
no, no,
There
no,
you
no,
go.
no. All right,
No,
and
nothing.
the name we will not bring up.
Indeed.
So touching, I just want to say something on what David said. I agree with all the aspects that, well, actually all of us have already touched on, but I think the culmination of the sword and sorcery character, it was an evolution and culminated in Conan, and each of the previous characters brought something to Howard's ability to deliver that character. So while the Shadow Kingdoms is acknowledged as the initial story that may have triggered that path, there's components of each character that were necessary to result in a Conan. And I'm going to probably say maybe the most controversial thing up here. I actually personally don't really consider Solomon Kane a sword and sorcery character. And Bran himself, borderlines. And my reason is because of their motivations. Solomon Kane had a hierarchy motivation to fight evil on behalf of good. Bran actually has the motivation to look out for his people from day one. He has, I mean, they're great stories. I love the stories, I love the character. But when you get to the defining sword and sorcery character, for me, it is Conan, because he starts with no higher goal other than have the sword and be the guy standing at the end of each moment each day. And I love that. So back to the original thing on there. As far as stories lengths, yes, I agree. I think the short story in a novella length probably gives you more pack for your punch. I do like Wagner a lot. I like the character of Kane a lot, but yeah, you can get a little long-winded in your novels and a little bit more padding. But then you get a little bit of world exploration. So as long as it's not getting all that introspective stuff, you're still getting,
And see, I'm guilty of some of the introspective
which I'm not
stuff.
against either. I just don't want pages of it. You
Right,
know?
no, it develops because you get into especially a longer format, you have a little more room to move, and you can do a little more world building, and you get more into character and drama, and I like that. I like having two people on the stage talking like Shakespeare or something, but you don't want to get too carried away with it. It just occurred to me that defining sword and sorcery may be a fool's errand, but it's kind of defined, what doctors call like a diagnosis of exclusion. You kind of define it by what it's not. And it's not heroic fantasy. True sword and sorcery characters are not heroic. No, it's absolutely true. When I say they came out of the Great Depression, think back a little bit to what Howard was doing with the Crusader stories, and he wrote these things with relish. I mean, I'd like to go back in time and just pay him, bags of money to just keep writing, those stories, because they're just wonderful. But they're very dark. They're very nihilistic. As I said in the little speech I gave last night, they're realistic, and he's telling the truth as he feels it about the human condition. He's reporting stuff. And that to me is very important also about sword and sorcery. Now, it's not lofty or anything. It's down in the gutter about surviving. And these people can have higher ideals, and they can be trying to do something better, and they can have relationships. But they're a lot more like us than the chivalrous people or the angelic people in high fantasy, whatever troubles they have. That's not us. We may aspire to that. An ancillary thought here, and then I'll turn it over for a second. But for the last week or two, I've been reading through David G. Hartwell's Age of Wonders, History of Science Fiction. And I bought it because a lot of people have referenced what he calls Appendix number 5, where he really goes to town about the entirely cynical approach that publishers took to producing high fantasy in the 80s and 90s. And if you remember any of that, what you had was the same painting by the same artists on the cover of these paperbacks with gigantic trees, sequoias in a forest with shafts of light coming down, and children or old men with staves, and maybe a unicorn or young women or something, and that's the farthest thing possible from sword and sorcery. Now, if you like that fiction, that's fine, but you go back to short stories, you go back to how gritty and real sword and sorcery is. It does work better in short fiction because they are war stories, they are westerns, they're about a clash of forces, and you're doing your best to survive in them, and it's horrific, it can be horrifying. That's where the weirdness and the horror comes in. That stands in for all this horrible stuff we can confront in life. And I think that's why it resonated in the Great Depression. I think that's why this fiction resonated with us in the 70s, post-Vietnam era. And I think it's why it resonates now, because our culture, again, is asking a lot of questions and we feel we're not on stable ground. So please take over.
Yeah, just to add to that, the conflicts in Sword and Sorcery aren't internal. That's not to say it's not. That's not to say that there's an occasional internal conflict, but it's not about introspection. If there are conflicts, they tend to be external. And I'm not saying it's anti-intellectual that they're only fighting monsters and they're only trying to solve, crises at hand. But high fantasy, you can have a character whose conflict is internal. Aragorn, whether or not he should become king, is just as important as the defending Gondor, right? That's not the case with Conan. You don't. If there are internal conflicts, it's not front and center. But then I also want to get you guys' opinion on this. Is just another thing contrasting Sword and Sorcery against high fantasy. The supernatural in Sword and Sorcery is different than the supernatural in high fantasy. The supernatural in Sword and Sorcery tends to always be a kind of transgression. Is that the case?
Mm-hmm.
Like a wizard in high fantasy can be good or bad. It depends on if he's Gandalf or if he's Saruman. But a sorcerer in the Conan stories and in Kull, like he's that necessarily it's a villain, because there's something wrong with this transgression of the natural order. But thoughts about that?
Yeah, they could be the wizards or the sorcerer. It could be as brutal and selfish as the protagonist. Once again, we're down at ground zero on the earth. So.
Well, and it's also a crutch. That's the way I've always looked at it. While I like your villainous magician and wizard and sorcerer and warlock, and a good threat, he's not mano a mano using his fists and his sword to fight his battle. He's using a crutch, a laser gun, for better or lack of description.
Yeah, I'd like to go back to David, who pointed out about the realism of of Sword and Sorcery. I mean, that is actually probably one of the most important aspects. That Howard did not get carried away and took all of this very, very serious.
That's exactly
and treated
right.
as really serious and did not playfully go around.
Right.
I mean, that's actually the problem with the pastiche that start to
Right.
come up with the extra fix, which then doesn't work. And then the other aspect is, for example, the action part, which is also very important. I mean, high fantasy takes its time until
Sure.
the action starts, and Sword and Sorcery starts from the very beginning. And in the end, I mean, this is probably storytelling at its finest. A good story is supposed to entertain and not make people wait until something exciting starts and before they doesn't want to fall asleep.
Right.
And that's actually by the story version
Exactly.
is so perfect. Howard was pretty good about it. He came up with the setting, introduced the main characters, and then just the action started, and
Exactly.
with hardly any stops. And that is actually what makes Sword and Sorcery out. And
He drops you in the middle of something. Larry Richter, he wrote the great essay, Richter, about how Howard starts with a train wreck. Or you're in a building where you don't know what door is going to open and where you're going to go. Now that sounds like existential real life to me. Here we are and we're all in the same position. And then how do you react to that? How do you deal with it? Well, in his situation, he's acting out for us, but he's explaining what we have to do in order to survive this and be the last man standing. Now, in terms of like internalization or characterization, my thought is, maybe not in all the stories, but in a lot of them, where we would have internal character development, we would go inside the character, it's simply projected or internalized in Sword and Sorcery. So that if you're in a dark tomb or something, that's the landscape of that character's soul right then, And if you're in a swamp, or if you're, wherever it might be a beautiful princess, and that's the landscape of your soul, and that may, be very pleasant. But that's the landscape that we're playing in right there. That's the landscape where it is, and you can call it names of the Hyborian era or whatever. But that's what he's doing with that. That's what's troubling the person inside, or what that person has to deal with. And now he's projected it or made it solid because it's a monster, or it's a swamp, or it's something like that. And it's not Gandalf. I can't say this often enough. It's not Gandalf and pretend wizards and stuff. in my speech last night, I made the point that Howard was telling the truth and that he was reporting the facts. And the more and more I go back and read his stuff and think about sword and sorcery fiction, that's what we're doing. We're telling the facts. If I told some of these stories to my uncle Jack, who was a cop in Youngstown, Ohio, or my dad, who was in World War II, he would nod and say, "Yeah, that's real life." See, we just put a polish on it so that we can emphasize those aspects that are so dramatic or kind of terrible for us as human beings.
Sorry to jump in. Then I shut
No,
up.
I'm done. I'm a chatterbox.
No, because what Jason mentioned, the internal conflict. I mean, if you look at Conan, there's actually also some kind of conflict, but it doesn't display in one story. For example, we have Conan, the guy who ultimately loves his freedom. In each story, he tells about how he enjoys freedom, and freedom, that's the ultimate thing. And the moment he becomes a king, he loses his freedom. And okay, we have the unedited version of Feelings on the Sword, where Conan clearly shows how much he grieves about that loss of freedom.
Right.
Then, when we read, for example, The Hour of the Dragon, here we have Conan, a king, and he loses his kingship. And wow, for Conan, that would have been actually the perfect opportunity to say, just, okay, I'm out of here, and goodbye.
Yeah.
And what he does is, I'm going to get my throne back. And hereby he sacrifices his freedom. But does he do it because he's on a power trip? Nope. He sees actually his people suffering, and that's where he says, okay, I need to stand up, and it means I take my power back, but in this process, I'm losing my freedom. And this actually also shows the growth of that character.
Right.
And unfortunately, this is, many people don't realize this. They only see those Conan stories where Conan kills monster, where
Some
Conan
monster
gets
or
a lady,
something, yeah.
and then we have Conan the moron,
Right,
and the Conan
right.
with no character. But this is actually out there. Okay, now I'm quiet.
Oh, okay. Do you have anything more to say?
Jumping on what you brought up earlier about trying to pull sword and sorcery up or out, that's always a hard argument to make. And while I love Frank Frazetta and I love all of his art, and I would want all of my books to have a Frazetta cover, personally, I really would, I think that actually might have been more of the pigeonholing than the genre itself, because I don't. It's hard to describe, but we've fixed
one-dimensional
that.
brute, yeah.
We fixed it, which is awesome, which is terribly
Yeah,
awesome.
I don't know,
But
that's
now defines what Conan looks like. And then we get the writing, whether it was good or bad, slowly did go downhill to become the D&D barbarian. I heard, I listened to give Rogues in the House a blurb. I listened to their discussion on what's a barbarian and a fighter in D&D, and that was actually very good, because if you just say you're a fighter, that means one thing. If you say you're a barbarian, it means another, and then you throw in Fafhrd, and you've got a singing barbarian who's but he's still a big-ass brute with a big-ass sword who can kick your ass,
Yeah.
So I think a lot of the media marketing that we've done has pigeonholed it in a way, and I don't know how you get out of that. I really don't, because I don't want to lose it either.
No, I'll tell you what, the way you get out of it, you don't play Dungeons and Dragons, you don't read comic books, you don't watch movies, you go back and read history, and you go back and read some of the fiction that Howard read, and you get a good grounding in what this stuff was, because there's a couple of anthologies out there that I tried reading, and clearly what these young writers were doing was just they were typing up something they'd done in a role-playing game. That's not sword and sorcery, that's a role-playing game, It has to have the heart and the real sense of danger in it, whether it's from a monster or a sorcerer or the conditions or whatever. That's what makes it worthwhile. That's what makes it pertinent to us. That's what gets our hearts racing and the emotional connection.
Jason, can I say something real quick? On your topic of the internal conflict, I think there is actually in a lot of Conan stories a lot of internal conflict. The difference is I have to have the sword and be the last man standing is the same philosophy on resolving that internal conflict. So sometimes we don't see the thought, but we see the choice and the deed. There's not 2 sentences of italicized internal tech or 4 pages of it because they explain other actions. He's like, pick the girl or pick the bag of treasure. We don't see the scene where he's riding his camel across the desert in between stories going, damn, I wish I got the bag of treasure, Could use a beer right now, But I mean, they're still there.
It's character defined by the action, not internalized, yeah.
Getting back to, of course, what Robert E. Howard did when he created his characters, one of the things that struck me when I'm thinking about sword and sorcery, we touched earlier on, well, I don't think that Solomon Kane was the first sword and sorcery character, and that could indeed be true, but what are some of the elements of sword and sorcery that actually make up sword and sorcery? You have to have action, an adventure, you have to have a horror element, and you have to have some magic in there. For me, anyway, that's the three elements that you need for sword and sorcery. And my argument for Solomon Kane is, of course, he had the action, he had the horror, and he also had the magic element. Especially when he was in Africa. Not in every story, but when he was in Africa, there was a magic element. But getting back to even farther back, maybe stories, some of Howard's werewolf stories, in the Forest of Dilleter, things like that. That might have been an early genesis for some of the sword and sorcery. So maybe we can discuss that.
No.
Sorry, I need to
Take that microphone away from that man.
How dare you? No, okay. No, Solomon Kane, with all due respect, I don't think so. He's no, he's
My back rib?
okay. No,
Take it outside.
okay. Take away the respect thing. No, for my in my case, I would say Solomon Kane. Why is he not sword and sorcery? Because he's way too much steeped in our world, in our realistic world. And for sword and sorcery, we need something like an alternative world, especially in the past, like for example the Atlantis setting in Kull, or Conan's Iborian age. And Solomon Kane, he has the horror elements, he has the historical elements, but for me, I would say he's still too much in our world, which is why I think that's not quite correct.
Can I respond?
I give up.
Can I respond?
Yeah, go respond. Yeah.
So,
Somebody support me.
well, first off, the labels, are too reductive, and then, it's hard to even, talk about something like sword and sorcery because every work is different. But I just with all due respect, I'm going to say Solomon Kane is a sword and sorcery character, because
Take it
if you
outside.
think about it as I think a component of sword and sorcery is the values that it expresses, and someone mentioned it's a kind of a quasi nihilistic genre. The characters live in a world that there's a paucity of meaning. But I think it's not accurate to say that the sword and sorcery world, the sword and sorcery protagonist is nihilistic. They have to forge their own meaning. They have to respond to a. You guys ever read Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning?
Yes, I
right?
have.
He says, life is always asking you, why do you want to continue, right? And I think that's the crisis of the sword and sorcery character, is they're always answering that question. They're always trying to find reasons to live. You think about Conan, he's becoming the king. He's actually, he has these ambitions and these experiences that he wants to have. But anyway, so on the basis of the values of sword and sorcery, Solomon Kane totally. I mean, he's actually a very effective sword and sorcery character because he's taken this kind of calling and he's really thrown himself into it. He's solved the existential problem that predicates all sword and sorcery characters. Situation. So, I don't know.
Okay, so
Stuff.
we've got 2 and 2. David's the tiebreaker. No,
But hang on, there's a difference in our reasons. I actually disagree with your settings argument. I don't think setting. I think sword and sorcery is an attitude, and it can be.
Interesting.
WWE characters. When I was growing up, that's a sword and sorcery character. A lone Shane walking across the desert. Borderline sword and sorcery character.
Shane, the Western, okay.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, but it's an attitude. First is my argument. Setting is about 4th on my list to make it.
Now I think the setting is symbolic of the attitude. So there we are.
Okay.
So, and I'm not kidding. I mean, that's the particular. When I started writing, I've written a lot of sword and sorcery. When I started out, I started writing little short stories, and I admired Howard and the Hyborian Age and all that. But I just started writing stories with funny names, and quirky stuff would happen, or it would be extremely violent or something. In the summer of '73, I was turning 21, and so I'm going to celebrate by writing a sword and sorcery novel. So that's where, if you ever heard of Oran, that's where Oran came from. But when I started that, I said I should start tying this kind of stuff together. And of course, Howard was in the back of my mind. I wasn't deliberately trying to ape Howard, but I was, because I came up with this island continent, and it has all these funny names. It was perhaps an early version of Earth, but the whole thing gets wiped out at the end, you know, and maybe there's some echoes of what becomes our civilization. But when I came up with the goofy map, what happened was that it freed me from worrying about a lot of things. You know, all of a sudden I could have any kind of weather that I wanted to have. All of a sudden there was no boundaries that held me in, as it would have if I tried to write the pirate story that I had tried to write when I was younger, or the historical novel when I was trying to. And so it freed me up from all that. I didn't have to worry about mountains or you know, what happened historically or something. I could concentrate on character and drama and build the density of the story that way and add the violence and the warfare. So if that gives us any kind of clue into what Howard was doing, that maybe it does, you know, and that landscape, that made-up land, all the shackles are off. You can go to where you want with it. And that's the way we'd like to be, you know, in those moments where we're reporting real life. You know, you're in Vietnam, or you're in a police shootout, or whatever it might be. You're compressed down to this, and there's no boundaries, and there's no rules or anything. And I think there's some of that in good sword and sorcery too. That this is what's happening. We're projecting a lot of stuff that's all coiled up inside us. Does that make sense to anyone? Yeah.
Yeah, and thinking about the setting and the values, the existential basis of sword and sorcery and the setting are combined. Because there's a Kull story, I forget which one it is, where Kull's walking. I think he's on a cavalry parade to the palace, and he's thinking to himself. He says, "Thousands of empires have come before, and thousands of empires will come after."
Yeah.
And I'm sorry.
I think it's the opening of Shadow Kingdom. That
Shadow
might be
Kingdom.
it, yeah.
So this ancient secondary world kind of emphasizes the existential situation. It's like, you don't matter in the long run, sir. You know, what is your answer to life right now? And so I think the sword and sorcery, aesthetic uses setting to kind of set the character up to have to answer that question of, what do you want to do with your life? You know.
Yeah, we're here and gone, and what are you going to do in this moment to make it worthwhile for you?
Once again, David, you mentioned the goofy maps.
Yes.
Okay, here, that's actually an interesting point, because once again, I think Howard took his world building really, really serious. I mean, Jeff wrote a lot of stuff about Howard's world building.
He did, yeah.
And so, many people think that Howard just made his Hyborian Age up, and Jeff, among us, has shown that there was actually a lot of work involved. The Hyborian Age went through many, many drafts, and once again, this realism that he took this serious. And so we have actually, that's actually why I feel the setting in this possible alternative world, our world, if in far distant, is pretty important. Howard, once again, took this really, really serious, and with this setting, that actually is also important for, popularity, I would say.
That was his way of writing history. That was his way of going back. And if he could write history, he would have loved to do that forever. This is his way of doing it, and that's the realism. Now, if you make up a world with funny names in them, it can still be realistic if you have strong. If stuff relates to us, you know, and with the drama and the dialogue and the characters and stuff, you can have the funny names and do high fantasy and approach, you know, your characters and situations completely differently, and we know all about that. But it depends on what you're using that landscape for to create these situations that are existential and are dangerous. And that's what sword and sorcery is for. I mean, we have to define it as what is it for. That's what it's for. You know, it's a shootout in the jungles of Vietnam, or it's being trapped, you know, by something evil in the streets of Chicago or whatever. But then it's the existential threat, but then it takes shape as something awful. And it might be a crazy sorcerer. It might be a plot that you find yourself in the middle of. You know, it could be anything like that. It almost doesn't matter. It's entertaining what you come up with. But that situation, that dangerous situation, is what we confront in life, and that's what we're experiencing with that. Does that work? Yeah.
Do you writer guys regard sword and sorcery as formalistic? Like that's always one pattern? Or-
Well, I don't know, that seems a little restrictive to me, but that actually is a fairly good question. I wanted to touch on something Dave said earlier that I've been thinking about this whole time and not listening to you at all, but talking about
Not required.
the
No.
nihilistic, I hate the school of thought that says the new sword and sorcery is grimdark. I despise that with a passion. Grimdark to me is nihilistic. Sword and sorcery is not nihilistic, but I liked what you said about I wish they'd tie the nihilistic more to his Crusader stories. I'd never thought of that before. That's again labels
Yeah,
pigeonhole.
yeah.
People start thinking one way only.
Yeah.
But I've never found a sword and sorcery character to be nihilistic. Never. I can't think of a single instance, single story where that had it in my brain, and I don't like them doing that. So formalistic, I guess, again, by exclusion, stay away from certain things would be my formalistic rule.
Maybe existential is a better term, and, you know, maybe we're sensing some nihilism.
But
or
sometimes,
something.
why am I living right now is
Yeah.
nothing beyond I'm going to throat punch life and
it.
survive
That's what it
because
is, exactly.
I'm superior until I'm not.
But see, that's exactly it, see, and that's the core root of this thing. And it's like, we might do something, we might act that way for honor, you know, in another situation. We might do that for love in another situation. But when you get down in the dirt with sword and sorcery, maybe those things are in the background, but it's just you and this other element, and one of you is only going to be left standing.
Right.
And that's very Howardian, and that's why we go back to him for sword and sorcery, I
Right.
think.
Yeah,
So,
I
yeah.
agree with you on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm thinking. The foundation just published the autobiographical writings, the Post-Oak and Santa Rosa. I recommend that because now I'm thinking it's weird. You know, it's not sword and sorcery protagonist is not nihilistic at all.
Mhm.
They're creating themselves. They're like
Oh.
they're struggling to respond to these things, and over time they're becoming themselves. And, you know, that's why Conan has all these names. He's Conan. You know, we don't like those
That's a
novels,
very
but
good point,
but
yeah.
he's taking on different roles and he's changing his dynamic. You know, Steve Costigan does that in Post-Oaks and
That's a
Santa
very-
Rosa.
that's a
Like
very
in
good
Post-Oaks and
point.
Santa Rosa, his quasi-autobiographical novel. It's all about like altering yourself. So it's not they're not nihilistic. They're the source of their own values. They're originating their own. They don't live in a valueless world. They've taken responsibility to create
They
value.
create their own value. And it makes sense in the Great Depression and the post-war world in the 70s and to a large degree where we are now. So, yeah.
Do we want to start opening up to questions, or do you guys have more thoughts on the matter? Let's, we
I can be
open up
quiet
to
for a
some
while, you know.
questions, and then we can still get these guys to yak some more.
Or shut up.
Yes, well, you know, we just saw the ending of probably the biggest media sensation going in recent years with Game of Thrones.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't think we would have ever had Game of Thrones without Robert E. Howard.
Oh,
I think
yeah.
you're right. I think
And
you're right.
I don't really consider the ending nihilistic because the dog was still alive. But, so for me, that's
Yeah.
The dire wolf is awesome,
But,
yeah.
But I mean, I've been thinking through what you've been talking about, you know, the existential threat when you're fighting something and you have to survive, and that's
Yeah.
very much Game of Thrones.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
They borrowed that, yeah, that's from Howard. Yeah.
but very much. I mean, I think we just saw Sword and Sorcery as developed by Howard, except with a cast of hundreds, become the biggest media sensation in the world,
Yeah.
sustained for a long period
Yeah.
of time. And we forget, what was it? They were talking about the audience of the final episode watched it last night, which is something absolutely incredible. 150
Oh, yeah, but it was so enormous, yeah.
Yeah.
I've only seen pieces of Game of Thrones, I'm sorry to say. We don't get HBO here.
But I mean, it's...
I have a kid, we watch Nickelodeon.
But
so.
it's themes of power, absolute power, corrupting absolutely, and characters who you thought were the heroes who become the villains because of power,
Yep.
and those who cared about them realizing that I'm trying to not do spoilers here.
No, that's okay, but see, a lot of this is very Shakespearean, and we know how much Howard appreciated Shakespeare and borrowed devices and ideas and even characterizations from Shakespeare.
And obviously, it's very influenced by Frazetta, you know, in the visuals. But I mean, just the whole bit of Game of Thrones is existential and just surviving, whether it's against the undead or.
And it had those horrific elements and those fantastic elements, yeah.
Right, and
As opposed to Band of Brothers or something.
and prove that the world could love and be just entranced and obsessed with the sword and sorcery elements that were already Howard.
No, they expanded on it,
Right.
yeah.
How many people
But
here were
still-
watching Game of Thrones, by the way?
Oh, I see, yeah, there.
That's right, and you recognize the sword and sorcery
Oh, absolutely.
elements.
And George R.R. Martin in his beginnings, huge props to Robert E. Howard.
Oh, yeah, yeah, okay, yeah.
Absolutely, and it probably wouldn't have happened without Robert E. Howard.
Right.
You know,
And perhaps the best thing that could happen to Robert E. Howard in the future, I mean, if there's going to be a major movie or series or something based someday in Conan, it will probably be due to the success of Game of Thrones.
Of Game of Thrones,
And someone
yeah.
saying, well, let's go back to the original. What other things can we do that might have this kind of depth? And
Maybe now, because they've never gotten Conan correct, because it's been too much like derivative sword and sorcery and high fantasy and
And I mean, Game of Thrones was political, and there were
Sure.
things on the consequences of power, and
Mm-hmm.
you know, the imprisonment of power at times. And
very Shakespearean, yeah.
Yeah, one of the things about the nihilism in the genre, but maybe not being like what Jason was saying, is in Conan's life, and also in Game of Thrones, there's this big question. You see Conan with individual adventures, but you know that it's leading towards him becoming worthy to be king. And Game of Thrones is the same thing as who is worthy to be king by what he's learned through his trials.
and who was unworthy.
And who is unworthy.
See-
And there's a meta theme to this, in not all, but in many, that's really interesting. I think that's what part of what captures people's imaginations is, how is this person growing? How does that happen? I don't know. What do you think of that?
Go ahead. Yeah.
Death is the final judgment. So like you die, and how did you live your life? You know, so like a lot of what, you know, winter is coming, to use the, you know, the platitude, right? It's about like intensity of life. Sword and sorcery is about intensity of life, and when you feel most alive, when the crazy reptilian monster is about to bite your head off. You know what I mean? So it sounds silly, like when, you know, we talked about Conan doesn't have introspection, right? He doesn't speak, you know, but when there's that speech in Belita of the Black Coast where he says, you know, I live, I love, I slay.
Right.
It's all about intensity of life. You know, I hope I'm not being too reductive here, but I think that's
No,
that's
you're
the
right.
anyhow. What do you guys think about that?
Well, when we say that, I'm sorry, but you go ahead.
absolutely.
Oh, okay. The idea that Conan, I would challenge you a bit on the idea that Conan knows that he's on this arc to become king.
No, I don't think
Yeah.
he knows. But
Oh,
I think
okay.
we know as a reader that he's a king.
Oh, I see,
And
'cause
you're
we know
still
from the beginning,
watching
from the
these
first story and
stories,
so on,
is
yeah,
this
gotcha.
is going into his maturation into
Right.
someone worthy to be a king.
Right.
And you always know that in the background.
I see what you mean then, yeah. Because my thought was that, you know, when Howard finally, we know this, when he finally got around to writing, you know, The Hour of the Dragon, it's a different kind of Conan in there than we get. I mean, he's always using the character. It's almost like there's 16 different Conans or something, you know. He'd get an idea, he'd come up with an idea, not even a plot device, an idea, you want to explore something, he put Conan in there. But it was never quite the same Conan. You know, it's a character that's shaded a little bit differently each time and so on. And I find that fascinating because you can see Howard's, you know, brain process working and how he's exploring these ideas and stuff, which I think is very, very useful. So he wasn't, far from being a one-dimensional character, Conan had like many dimensions, you know, and that comes through as we read the stories. So I didn't say very much just now, but but I talked a lot.
Half cent a word, half cent a word.
That's it.
This morning, a panel talked about how there was savagery, barbarism in the middle,
Right.
and civilization on the other
Right.
side. Could that also be termed as savagery would be what I want, that particular individual, his expediency, and barbarism could be called what a person's moral code is, presumably something more than savagery. In civilization, can that be called what a group of people would call a moral code?
That's interesting. I never quite thought of it in that way. Do you have any thoughts?
Okay, the barbarism in Howard stories. Okay, I'm going a little bit far if I say this, but when we look at the letters between Howard and Lovecraft, when they talk about barbarism and civilization, I think the moral codex you are mentioning, that is definitely part of it. And I think Howard's kind of barbarism was pretty much styled after the era of the Old Frontier, Old West. Because when you see, whenever he argues for how much better barbarism was, he usually comes up with examples from my grandfather, who was one of the old-timers. He did business by lending money to people he didn't know because he just trusted them. And at the frontier, trust was everything. There were no lawyers around there, and the person that was called a liar was brandmarked. Nobody would deal with that person. For example, I mean, if you watch these old Western in before the 60s, then usually before a gunfight, there come words like liar, you're a liar. I mean, compared with Quentin Tarantino, what you say nowadays.
There was a code of the West.
And liar, that was. These were fighting
there is a
words.
code of the West.
And
very,
so
very
I would
much.
say that the barbarism we have in Howard Conan stories is pretty much based in the Old West. And that's once again, and with Howard being a big fan of Texas, this makes him actually indirectly also a Texas writer.
I think today in some political circles in Washington, the term liar might be termed a compliment.
Okay, I'm one of
We're not going there.
I'm
getting back to Robert Howard.
I'm not going to comment here on that one.
Jeff Edders.
Jeff Edders.
Yes, Ed.
Just real quick. First of all, great panel, guys.
Thank you.
Really, really good discussion. I think just getting back to the idea of having to try to define sword sorcery and putting genre labels on things, as Jason says, that can be tricky. And in the case of sword and sorcery, as David said, it's often a fool's errand, right? The term sword and sorcery itself really just came out of a fanzine conversation back and forth between the library and the early 60s. What do we call this stuff that we're all writing? You know? And so, but if you think about it, even Moorcock and Library were writing very different types of fantasy. You know? So these labels are only useful as long as they are ways that we can further the discussion about this.
That's a good point, yeah.
Which is what we're doing.
Yeah.
Here,
Right.
And what we see is every one of you, all five of you on this panel, have a slightly different definition of what sword and sorcery is. And so because
Jason's is the right one, by the way.
Which Jason? Oh, no. That one.
you know, there is no right? And because of that, different stories and different characters, you will say, hey, maybe this is sword and sorcery. Well, no, because it doesn't have this. For me, it's got to be this way. So all of these are right? None of them are wrong. So something to think about for me, just to throw this out there and see what get your thoughts on it. I had to, Gary Hopkinson had read a chapter for it was kind of like a textbook that he was doing on pulp fiction, with the idea that the audience would be undergraduate students that had never read sword and sorcery or pulp fiction or whatever.
Oh, interesting, yeah.
So he basically asked me, write an article during the Fool's Errand.
So somebody has to do it, yeah.
So you got to do it. So you start looking at how other people have defined it, and everybody's got everyone that's defined it is a little bit different, right? John Clute's got his definition, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
So the way I defined it, so I had to come up with my own, is touching on one of the things that Jason mentioned earlier. How is, I contrasted it to high fantasy, which most people are going to be familiar with because they're used to Tolkien and Tolkien-esque, the Terry Brooks knockoffs that all came after. So I touched on how the supernatural is treated differently.
Nice.
That's sort of a focus. And in doing so, it kind of went back to this idea of where does it start? Is it with this historical horror type stuff? The werewolf stories, the Solomon King stories, where do you draw that line? And I also was looking at, I don't know who's familiar with Farrah Mendelssohn's work, Rhetorics of Fantasy, where she's one of the more prominent fantasy scholars today, and she tried to come up with a framework for defining types of fantasy. One of them is the immersive fantasy, right, where it's a full-on fantasy world that you begin inside this world, right, as opposed to like a portal fantasy, like a Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where you start in our world and you get transported into a fantasy world. And then there's intrusive fantasies, right, where it's an empirical world, but the supernatural element intrudes into it, like most horror stories. Okay? So, and she defined the Conan story. She throws them out there. You know, she talks about individual stories by authors. When it comes to Conan, she does the same thing that most fantasy scholars unfortunately do. In the Conan series, right, what does that mean, right? You know, is that Howard? Is that Jordan? You know.
Oh God,
But she describes the Conan stories as being an immersive fantasy. This is a full-blown fantasy world that you're dropped into. And so there's elements of that, but what I did, I really disagreed with that and made the argument that no, really, Howard's Sword and Sorcery is really more of an intrusive fantasy, more like a horror story. Although it's set generally in a pre-technological, even a secondary world, right? He's told these ones, right? But it's really, the supernatural elements are often intrusive, right? In Howard's, and that should be no surprise, he's writing for a horror magazine, right? Or a fiction magazine. And
but he really wants to write history or
really
adventure.
Wants to write history. So what he's really writing is historical adventure stories, the Crusade stories, right? The swashbuckling adventure, the pirate stories of Sabatini, right? He's writing all these genres, but adding this intrusive horror element, which Andy mentioned for him is important, right? That horror element that's in there, right? So this isn't the magical world of Hyboria, right? And that's what he's creating. Right? It's not, the supernatural isn't an inherent part of the world, right? It's, these sorcerous elements are elements that come into this empirical, rational, realistic
That's a really good point, Jeff. Yeah.
And the conflict, right, that drives the plot is usually this heroic protagonist or whatever. Not even necessarily heroic or anti-heroic or whatever. The protagonist, this figure that has to come in conflict with this intrusive element and bring back the rational world, at the end of the it's that usually drives the plot. So that's how I try to kind of define it by what you picked up on, is the difference in how the supernatural.
You know what's interesting about that? If I could say something real quick here. No, what's interesting, because you touched upon the point of the magazine I was writing for, and that's Farnsworth Wright. And if you go back and look at a lot of stories in that magazine, I mean, Farnsworth Wright would turn down stories that are extraordinarily good. I'm not faulting him. He always had to keep one eye on the cost of doing business in the Great Depression. But with that in mind, what strikes me at least, now when you look at those stories, they would throw a monster in there, or they would throw a ghost in there. And that just seems quaint to us now, but that was enough to sell a story to Weird Tales. So you have the Firebasher Batapult or something, He really wanted to write a Conan story where it was basically historical fiction, but he had to put a naked babe in it to get the cover, or he had to put a monster in it, to satisfy Farnsworth Wright. But what he really wanted to write was Beyond the Black River, and the Scarlet Citadel and stuff like that, see? So I guess the point is that we can't forget that he had to write for his markets. And again, despite that, look at the fantastic work he did.
We're going to go way in the back of the...
It was touched on briefly in the panel talking about, an Hour of the Dragon, part of what Conan's motivation is helping his king. And this kind of ties into the Solomon Kane thing too. Couldn't Sword and Sorcery be defined versus the Kings and Empires, Tolkien and Robert Jordan and all that? Are we looking at a more proletarian focus with Robert Howard and his work where, by the Saxon rule, the fundamental issue that gets the story rolling is there is an insanely stupid rule that's preventing two kids from dating. It's so low form and low focus, and it's so personal and human. And then in Hills of the Dead and Solomon Kane stories, the effects aren't about empire in Africa or colonialism. There's a tribe that nobody else cares about that's under attack, and even though his plan fails horribly, Solomon Kane's the only guy showing up to help the poor, literally the poor. And you see that with Bran McMorn and Kings of the Night. They don't draw Kull out to save Britain. It's I'm king of this pathetic people that is about to be steamrolled by this empire. What can I do to just keep their lives happy for another couple of days? Right? Isn't it more of a working class focus from Howard's?
There's some of that. Yeah, there's some of that in him. I don't know. Is it an overriding theme with him? I think it comes back once in a while. I don't see it as being a big focus of his work.
I wouldn't use proletariat. I would use populist. You know,
Oh.
that's a very important distinction. There's savagery, barbarism, which is good, and then there's civilization. Civilization is often defined as having these very constraining conventions that are preposterous, and what by the Saxai rule, breaking the tablet of laws. It's but the reason why I said populace rather than proletariat is because populace is all about the individual. Like these two kids want to get married, and the collective civilization, moral code is what's blocking them, and so I'm going to shatter that. So
Good
populace.
point.
Yeah.
Yeah, good point.
Dave?
And then revisit sort of whether or not Bran McMorn and Solomon Kane are Sword and Sorcery. I mean, it seems to me, first of all, Sword and Sorcery is a style. And Howard didn't know he was creating Sword and Sorcery.
Right.
But you can point out to a number of writers who are sort of definitional in what we sort of think of, like Chris Leiber, Michael Moorcock. You throw in maybe Charles Saunders, I don't know. One thing that occurs to me is Leiber, Moorcock, and Saunders all define themselves in their writings in some way in relation to specifically Conan. Leiber said, well, I don't want to write Tross and Conan again. Moorcock goes and creates like the anti-Conan.
Right, yeah.
Saunders creates the African Conan. Whoever defined themselves in relation, they're writing in relation to Bran McMorn and Solomon Kane.
Right.
And if not, well, then
I think that's why.
they just, I always thought they were Sword and Sorcery, but maybe they really do represent a path not taken.
Maybe, yeah. I've always thought of Conan, he's kind of like an archetype in that way. I guess that would be my thought on it. I'm not. No one's patterning heroes after, but I think the Hyborian world is a big part of it too, as well as the attitude, and the character of Conan. Do you have any thoughts?
We got one more, and then we're going to have to wrap it up.
Oh, okay. I'm just getting started.
On several occasions, you've used the E word, existentialism.
Oh, yeah.
Now, of course, Howard is writing before Sartre, and existentialism becomes a movement in the 50s and 60s. So, and I don't think you're saying that Bob is sitting over there saying, okay, I'm going to make...
Not at all.
But, and I understand that existential is, as an adjective is different than existentialism as a noun. But David, it's something that you said that I found jarring. You said that, well, in Sword and Sorcery, these guys aren't heroic.
Thank you. I wanted to get back to that.
But if we accept that these stories aren't existential in their nature, in his personal code, sometimes being the last guy standing
Is heroic.
Correct.
It could be heroic.
Correct.
Sure.
Yes.
In that particular
Not
situation.
conventionally.
Right.
And I agree that
Right,
they
not
aren't
conventionally.
heroic.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Can I jump on this one?
Please, yes, sir.
I wanted to get back to that, actually. I think that's very important, and I think we're losing in the last 20 years a very big mouthful, the Lord Byronic hero. Anti-heroes are Charlie Brown, Dagwood, Bumstead. The person who can't be a hero who does something heroic. That's an anti-hero. Look up the definition. That's an anti-hero. Not these jackasses who don't want to be heroic and stumble into being heroic. That's the Lord Byronic hero. I'm out for myself, and if it happens to benefit other people, yay for me, but I didn't intend that. So that's the Sword and Sorcery hero, but nobody says that anymore, and we keep lumping anti-heroes together and then make them popular, which the Lord Byronic hero can be popular, if it's done right. We don't all want a Lord Byron, to date our daughters, but we might want Lord Byron to be the last guy standing with me in the dike, Right. So, yeah.
The most existential moment I've ever seen on film is at the end of The Wild Bunch, where they've killed Mapache. It looks like, hey, we may be able to walk away from this. And then Pike, they exchange that look. Now, he said,
Yeah.
And I said, no.
Yeah.
Let's end this here.
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense to me, but it made sense to them.
Right.
And in their world, that was the heroic thing to do.
Right, even though it cost them, you know, yeah.
And I,
Yep.
I say sword and sorcery,
Yep.
guys doing that all the time.
Right.
Well, sadly, we are gonna have to end this here.
Did I talk about World War One? No?
Start
Okay.
another panel. Now, this is a pretty good panel, I think. And, so first of all, let's give a hand to the four.
I can clap for you guys. Thank you, man. Yeah, that was fun. That was really fun. Thank you. Thanks, Jason.
And also, I can